He was an ambitious young man with a plan for his future.
He aspired to be a police officer. He wanted a family.
And she was a single mom.
It was kind of the perfect match.
They were expecting a baby girl.
But then it all went up in smoke.
The fire department located a body.
He was lying between his bed and the wall.
And his death may not have been an accident.
This was probably deliberately set.
There was an accelerant used.
Was the would-be cop on the wrong side of the law?
There were frequently people coming into the apartment.
It is a very dangerous game.
Or was it personal?
He'd actually shot somebody.
Yeah, right.
Things might not be quite what they seemed.
There was an attempt to cover up the crime.
It's almost a perfect way to commit a murder.
Every time we turn around, guess where the finger points?
July 23rd, 2005. It's Saturday night in Green Acres, Florida, a suburb of 30,000 just outside West Palm Beach.
It's located in the middle of the county, not close to any beaches, more of a community where average people live and work.
Everybody seems very neighborly, very friendly.
It's a very quiet place.
But at 11 o'clock, sirens break the tranquil peace of the warm summer night.
A 911 call came in reporting a fire at an apartment complex.
There were flames and lots of smoke.
When the firefighters arrive, they quickly determine that the fire is confined to a single apartment.
And according to the neighbors, the tenants are named Samuel Norris Jr. and his girlfriend, Shara Cooper.
25-year-old Samuel Norris Jr. was known around Green Acres as an outgoing, personable young man.
He got along with basically everybody. There wasn't really anybody who could say that they had any issue at all with Mr. Norris.
Sam had grown up watching his mother work hard to make ends meet.
He came from a single mother home, and his mom instilled a strong work ethic in him.
He worked at the bus station, he worked at a hospital, and at night he was a bouncer at a club.
But his ultimate goal was to become a police officer.
That's a true testament of his character. When you want to become a police officer, you have that innate desire to protect and provide.
It also meant that Sam had to keep himself out of trouble.
To be a police officer, you sort of have to have a clean background and be willing to stay on the right path.
And he didn't always walk it alone.
Samuel never had a problem with the ladies. That was a department that he had mastered very well.
But that didn't mean the aspiring policeman was just a player.
Samuel, being the way that he was and the way that he was raised, he wanted a family.
He was looking for someone to build a future with.
And when Sam met 18-year-old Shara Cooper, he thought maybe he'd found her.
Although she was 18 and he was 25, she was very mature for her age.
Because she had to be.
Well, I was just about to hang out with some friends if you want to tag along.
Oh, I wish I could, but I have to go relieve my babysitter.
You got a kid?
I do. I have a daughter.
Shara already had a 4-year-old daughter that she gave birth to when she was only 14 years old.
That forces you to mature very quickly.
You have another little person who's going to depend on you for everything.
But Shara wouldn't be on her own for long.
I'd like to meet her sometime.
Really? That didn't scare you at all?
No, not at all.
So they ended up dating and moving in together. And shortly thereafter, they were expecting a baby girl.
For Shara, it was a chance to start her life over.
She was older now. They were in a relationship. So now bringing another child into the world brings a couple together, makes them closer, and strengthens the bond.
And by the summer of 2005, they were looking forward to the baby's arrival.
For someone to choose and actively pursue a family life at such a young age, it speaks volumes to their determination and also their willingness to share and compromise with another person.
But now, the family's future is in jeopardy as firefighters work to put out the flames in their apartment.
They were able to get in through the unlocked front door, and they made their way to the master bedroom.
Firefighters have the flames under control within minutes, but it's not soon enough.
While they're going from room to room, they locate a body.
It appears to be the body of a black male.
He was burnt beyond recognition.
Samuel Norris Jr. and his girlfriend, Shara Cooper, were building a life together in Green Acres, Florida.
When he met Shara, he thought he found his person.
And Shara, already a single mom, was just as enamored with Samuel.
It was kind of the perfect match. He saw the family that he wanted to build for himself.
And she saw a great father figure for her child.
He took on several different jobs to be able to be a provider and definitely had a promising future.
But now, that future may have gone up in smoke.
Emergency crews responding to a fire call have just found a man's badly burned body inside the couple's apartment.
He was lying on the floor between his bed and the wall.
And based on the scene, firefighters believe the fire started at the bed.
It was basically destroyed. It was gone. It was down to the springs. The fire marshal knew pretty quickly that this was probably deliberately set.
Suspecting foul play, the firefighters call arson and homicide investigators out to the scene.
For the detectives, the challenge is determining if the victim is Sam.
A lot of times you do have DNA that's left. You may have fingerprints.
But when the medical examiner's team arrives to remove the body for autopsy, they make a surprising discovery.
There was blood underneath his head.
Does that mean he didn't die in the fire?
In this case, the body was so burned that it was very hard to determine.
While the medical examiner's team deals with the body, crime scene investigators document the surroundings.
Because fire causes a lot of destruction of evidence, your best evidence at this point is going to be the photographs of the scene.
They pay particularly close attention to the bedroom windows.
The heat inside the room had shattered some of the windows, but one of the windows was boarded up with plywood, as if it had been broken before the fire.
Outside the apartment, the detectives canvass the neighbors and onlookers watching from behind the police tape.
Their neighbors said that they hadn't seen or heard anything suspicious around the time the fire started.
But they're shocked when the medical examiner's team comes out of the apartment with a body bag.
It can't be!
The cars are gone.
Usually when Samuel's SUV or Shara's car was missing, that meant that they were not home.
Well, either the car's here earlier?
Yeah, this morning.
But just a few minutes later, Shara shows back up at the complex.
What happened? Where's Sam?
Ma'am, I'm sorry. I'm afraid.
No! No!
The detectives tell Shara about the body they found and that they think it may be Sam.
This has to be a mistake.
She was very confused because he worked at night, so by all accounts, he should not have even been in the house.
Could that mean the victim isn't Sam? Or is Shara simply in denial?
There there's confusion, there's anxiety, and then you have all of these people interviewing you. That's a lot to handle.
The neighbor said you have a daughter?
Do you know where she is?
Yeah, she's with my mom.
The detectives tell Shara they have reason to believe that the fire may have been set on purpose.
Do you know anyone that would want to hurt Sam?
No, everyone liked him. Everybody.
She was unaware of anyone who would possibly cause harm to Samuel.
But Shara also says that Sam has been hanging out with some dangerous people.
What do you mean?
Shara said that Samuel had been involved in selling drugs.
I told him it was a bad idea.
Once you get involved with drugs, you put your life at stake.
Detectives investigating a homicide in Green Acres, Florida, now believe their victim is 25-year-old Samuel Norris Jr.
When police officers discovered the body, it appeared to have been an accident, but as they analyzed the situation a little more, it seemed suspicious.
They were able to determine pretty early on that this wasn't an accidental fire.
And they suspect it may have been set to make Sam's death look like an accident.
But who would want Sam dead? For answers, the detectives turn to his girlfriend, Shara Cooper.
It isn't easy, given the circumstances.
You've just been told a loved one has died in a tragic fire, and now you're being asked for information.
However, she does have some important information for the detectives.
He was dealing.
You mean drugs?
Yeah.
The news takes the detectives by surprise.
Sam's neighbor had talked about what a good guy he was. Even said that Sam told him he wanted to be a cop.
He was looking forward to joining the police academy.
But according to Shara, Sam had started dealing after he began working security at a club.
That is typically the environment where those kinds of activities happen. And with Samuel having a child on the way and he's working multiple jobs, that was possibly his way to figure out how to make ends meet.
Shara says Sam had started dealing crack cocaine on the side.
Shara mentioned that Sam stored some of the drugs in the apartment and that there were frequently people coming into the apartment.
She says the last time someone came by was around 8 o'clock on Friday, the night before the fire.
He said his name was Paul.
But he didn't try to come in?
No.
But if he had come in, she says she was prepared.
Sam had a gun that he always kept in the bedroom.
For protection?
Yeah.
But she actually said that he had used the firearm.
He'd actually shot somebody?
Well, he didn't go into details.
But if he had shot someone, could Sam's murder be payback?
There is possibly some people out there who may have been upset with Samuel.
And the fire may not have been their first attempt at revenge.
Shara tells them that the day before, she'd returned home from work to what felt like a threat.
She had come home earlier in the day and had discovered the broken window.
And her apartment's office had seen it too.
The maintenance man responded to put a temporary piece of plywood on that broken window till the glass could get replaced.
Any idea who broke it?
No.
You think it had something to do with the fire?
I don't know. Maybe.
Next, detectives want to know more about Shara's relationship with Sam.
Investigators have to be able to objectively assess whether the significant other is a possible suspect.
But she expresses that they're a normal couple.
They were excited about the impending birth of their child, and they had nothing more than usual, typical disagreements with each other.
When you are that age, you're still trying to figure yourself out, let alone figuring out another human being. You're going to have things that get on your nerves.
In fact, Shara says she'd had an argument with Sam just that morning.
They had gotten into an argument, but they were able to smooth things over.
Although Shara admits that she left the apartment around 6 that evening just to give Sam some space.
Where'd you go?
I went to see my sister and then I drove down to Fort Lauderdale.
Shara says she was on her way back when a neighbor called to tell her about the fire.
I didn't know Sam was still here. I thought he was at work.
After talking to Shara, the detectives head back to the station to look for any records that might suggest that Sam was involved in something nefarious.
They try and substantiate the claims by going to a database and seeing if there was ever any arrests based on drugs or violence.
But their search comes up empty.
No firearm charges or anything to do with drug dealing.
Unable to find any evidence of drug dealing in their records, they turn to Sam's family.
Like Shara, Sam's family is devastated about his death in the fire.
But when the detectives ask whether Sam had anything to do with drugs, their answers are vastly different from Shara's.
No way. Sam would never get involved with anything like that.
Sam's family didn't believe that he would be involved in drug dealing or criminal activity at all. That was outside of his character, especially with him having the desire to become law enforcement.
Still, it's possible that Sam had been keeping his family in the dark.
Shara may have known something different than what Samuel's family had been aware of.
However, Shara's claim that Sam was dealing isn't the only thing from her interview that his family disagrees with.
Samuel's family shared with them that the relationship that Shara and Samuel had was not a smooth, beautiful, and happy relationship. It was somewhat tumultuous.
Sam really felt that she wasn't satisfied with anything he did. No matter what he did, it wasn't enough.
But according to Sam's brother, Shara's attitude was only part of the problem.
He told me that Shara was over there messing around with other guys.
But he knew that for a fact?
Well, that's what he told me.
And according to the family, Sam was thinking about moving out.
He was done with her.
But she's having this kid.
Yeah, right.
Sam really didn't even know whether or not that baby was his.
In fact, he demanded Shara take a paternity test.
Samuel Norris Jr.'s family has just revealed to detectives that he was on the verge of ending things with his girlfriend, Shara Cooper.
Samuel had shared with his family that he was frustrated with Shara because he had done so much for her, and she seemed to be very ungrateful.
Worse, he suspected that Shara's baby wasn't his.
He told her that he wanted her to take one of those tests, to find out if he was actually the father.
Paternity test?
Yeah.
But while Sam suspected that Shara had been sleeping with someone else, his brother also says that Shara was an incredibly jealous woman.
She was constantly monitoring his behavior.
Like she used to follow him when he left for work just to make sure that's where he was going.
And if she couldn't find him, she'd drive around till she could find him.
It was a very tumultuous relationship, and they were off and on throughout the year.
At one point, he moved out.
But even then, he only moved back in with her because she was pregnant.
However, while the couple had been apart, Sam had met somebody new.
Her name is Danielle Hubbard.
Being with Danielle was a much needed and refreshing change from what he had been experiencing with Shara.
It had started as a casual fling, but quickly grew into something more serious.
He started to really care about Danielle. And so now he's caught in between the two.
Which explains why he'd been pushing Shara to take a paternity test.
Sam wanted to do the right thing.
But if the paternity test would show that he was not the father of the baby, he could move on.
But now the detectives wonder if Sam's desire to do the right thing had cost him his life.
Anytime an investigation uncovers a love triangle, detectives start to think about whether jealousy and anger are motives for what happened.
Was Danielle angry that Sam had gone back to Shara?
Could she have been pushed over the limits because he left?
Or did Shara fear he'd leave her for Danielle?
Even when he got back with Shara, it was difficult for him to cut off that relationship with Danielle.
I think Sam Norris really missed that relationship and realized that maybe he had made a mistake.
That's basically what the paternity test was about. He wanted out.
The following morning, detectives asked Danielle to come in for an interview.
At this point, they're looking for a timeline as to their relationship. They're looking at if she's jealous, how much she knows about the current girlfriend.
And has she heard about the fire?
So you really think it's him?
We haven't confirmed the identity, but we believe it's him.
I knew it. I knew when he didn't answer his phone. I knew it.
She was devastated to hear that Samuel was no longer with us.
Danielle expressed that her and Sam were really in love.
Danielle says that when she started seeing Sam, she didn't know about Shara.
But Shara knew about her.
Hello?
Do you know who this is?
Shara began harassing her.
Leave my man alone.
Does that make you angry?
Oh, yeah, but he said that he was only with her on account of the baby.
Danielle lets us know that Samuel was still operating with the idea of doing what is right for his family. And Samuel had plans to try to make things work with Shara.
Danielle respected that because that is something that she would expect a real man to do.
At least that's what Danielle claims.
It's possible that she was more jealous than she led on.
Where were you last night?
At my mama's house.
When was that exactly?
Like 7 to 11:30.
If that's true, it's unlikely Danielle could have set the fire.
But if Danielle didn't do it, who did?
You believe Shara is capable of killing Sam?
I don't know, but I don't know who else would want to hurt him.
After the interview, the detectives follow up with Danielle's mother.
Her alibi checks out.
Danielle Hubbard had nothing to do with this.
Thank you.
And was just an unfortunate victim as well.
With Danielle in the clear, the detectives head back to Sam and Shara's apartment.
The arson investigators have finished their work, so the detectives are able to search unimpeded.
They don't find the gun Shara said Sam kept in the apartment, but they do find ammunition.
So it looks like Shara was telling the truth about the gun.
But that doesn't necessarily mean Sam was a drug dealer.
They were unable to find anything to support Shara Cooper's claim that he was involved in illicit drug trade.
However, the investigators are unable to find Sam's keys, wallet, or cell phone.
Which raises the possibility that rather than a love triangle, detectives are dealing with a simple robbery.
Maybe the robber had a confrontation with Sam, took his wallet, phone, and his gun and set the fire before driving off in Sam's missing SUV.
Hoping for a lead on the killer, the detectives issue a be on the lookout for Sam's SUV.
Finding the SUV could possibly lead them to Sam's killer.
Because when the detectives get the autopsy results, the findings not only confirm that the dead man is Sam, they confirm they're also investigating a murder.
Mr. Norris actually didn't perish in the fire.
He actually had been shot in the back of the head.
Detectives investigating the deadly fire at the apartment Samuel Norris Jr. shared with his girlfriend, Shara Cooper, have received confirmation that the body in the bedroom was the 25-year-old nightclub bouncer.
But despite the severe burns he suffered, the fire did not kill him.
Samuel was already dead when the fire was started.
He had been shot.
During the autopsy, a projectile was recovered from the head of Sam Norris.
The bullet recovered from the body is .38 caliber.
The ammunition for Mr. Norris's firearm was the same exact type of ammunition.
But his gun was missing from the apartment.
Which leads detectives to suspect that Sam had been killed while he slept with his own gun.
And if that was the case, whoever killed him entered the apartment without waking him and knew where he kept his guns.
Based on what they've learned, the detectives decide it's time they had another conversation with Shara.
They call her back down to the police station once again.
I'm going to ask you about everything that we have that there were some questions on.
A lot of what Shara was saying just didn't add up. What made more sense is that she finds out that Sam didn't cut off the relationship with Danielle. That's definitely a strong motive.
They ask her about the inconsistencies that she's been giving, and they talk to her about things that she had failed to share with them.
Just at this point, we're concerned about making sure that you're being honest with us.
They also revealed that Sam wasn't killed by the fire.
Once investigators sort of press Shara about what happened, she kind of breaks.
She decides to tell them that she thinks she knows who may have done this.
She says it may have been an old boyfriend of hers named Ricky Hughes.
He was into drugs and everything else like that.
She said the relationship was over before she met Sam.
But Shara says that Ricky had a hard time getting the message.
He was still calling me, he'll come back.
And she says he'd recently started harassing her. And Sam, too.
He knew about me and Sam.
And on the day of the fire, he showed up at the apartment.
Ricky got into an argument with Sam.
Where were you when this happened?
Was in a room.
In the bedroom?
He answered the door. I heard the voices. Sam asked him what he wanted with me.
Shara says the conversation got heated.
She said Ricky left and Sam didn't say anything to her about what happened.
Then, to let the situation settle, she went to her sister's house.
She had left to give Sam some space.
But while at her sister's house, Ricky shows up.
He actually has phones with my boy.
What are you playing at?
He tells her, I've been by your house, I shot Samuel, and then I set the house on fire.
Why didn't you tell us this on Saturday? The day that it happened.
The day that it happened.
Yeah.
Shara says it's because Ricky had threatened her.
He said if anybody asked you anything, you didn't see me today. Look at this girl. But it's in my head repeated itself. He said, you know where I stay, he knows where he knows everything about me. He knows where my mother works, knows where my father works. He knows exactly where I'm at.
And he tells her, and if you tell anybody, the same is going to happen to you.
You try it. Do it again.
Shara says that's why she hadn't told them about Ricky before.
Shara said he's the one that did it.
But when detectives contact Ricky Hughes, he doesn't act like a man with something to hide.
He immediately agrees to come in for an interview.
We took a statement from Shara, and she told us that you were involved in the killing of her boyfriend, Sam Norris.
Confronted with Shara's accusation, Ricky appears shocked and confused.
He doesn't even know who Sam is.
According to Ricky, He hasn't talked to Shara in years.
Can you tell me where you were at on Saturday, July 23rd?
I was gone.
And you didn't have nothing to do with Sam being killed?
No.
When the detectives follow up with the dog track, his alibi checks out.
There are multiple people who saw him there that evening.
They're able to exonerate him.
Which means that Shara has been lying to the detectives from the beginning.
So they're really looking at her very strongly as being involved in this death.
But it will take more than her lies and a tumultuous relationship to charge her with murder.
The breakthrough comes more than a month later, when detectives get word that a patrol officer has located Sam's SUV.
The SUV was spotted in the parking lot of an apartment complex, about 20 minutes from Sam's apartment.
When they locate the SUV, it had been stripped of its rims as well as the stereo system. So they started questioning some of the residents that lived in the apartment complex to see if they can find anybody that knew Shara or Sam.
Several people point detectives towards a tenant in the complex, a man named Dominic Glover.
Can I help y'all?
How you doing? You know Shara Cooper?
Dating her sister.
So you have Sam's vehicle that was stolen from the scene, and now we find it at the sister's boyfriend's apartment complex.
That vehicle out there belonged to Shara Cooper's boyfriend.
I mean, I don't know anything about it.
Come on, guy. You don't know anything about that vehicle.
But when detectives pressure him, Dominic tells them exactly how Sam's SUV got there.
He confessed that Shara had asked him to steal Samuel's SUV.
He said, she picked me up and took me to the house and gave me the keys.
And she also gave him Samuel's gun.
Detectives investigating the murder of Samuel Norris Jr. have located his missing SUV and the man who admits he drove it away from the crime scene.
Dominic Glover was dating the sister of Sam's girlfriend, Shara Cooper.
He basically says, at the instruction of Shara, he took the vehicle and stripped it down and sold stuff for parts.
Why would she actually do that?
I don't know. I figured she was mad at him.
He said, she called me to meet her and took me to the house and gave me the keys.
Dominic says Shara also gave him Sam's gun.
What'd you do with the gun? Sold it. And all the parts in the SUV.
But Dominic swears he had nothing to do with Sam's death.
He told them that he found out the very next day that Samuel had been killed in a fire.
Why would she, on the day that they found her boyfriend deceased, have her sister's boyfriend take Sam's vehicle?
Now convinced that Shara is behind Sam's murder, the detectives head back to the station to contact the apartment complex's maintenance man.
When police officers were speaking with Shara, she shared with them that someone had broken the window of the master bedroom.
An apartment office worker had noticed the broken window and called her to set up an appointment to repair it.
The maintenance person came to the apartment to fix the window, but it was a very odd encounter.
While he was in there, he notices that Mr. Norris is in bed.
I can come back.
Oh, no, he's okay. He just took a sleeping pill.
He said his head was covered up and he wasn't moving.
The maintenance man says he had to nail the plywood over the window. And still, Sam didn't budge.
All the time that he was doing that work, not one time did this man wake up. Not one time did he move from the position that he was in.
For the detectives, there's only one possible explanation.
When the window was replaced, he was most likely already dead.
Adding that to what they've learned from Dominic Glover about Sam's stolen SUV, the detectives are ready to make an arrest.
All of those factors combined were enough for the warrant.
Once Shara's taken into custody and brought into the interview room, the detectives confront her with everything they've learned.
They went back to Shara Cooper to say, you know, this stuff isn't adding up.
So much time has passed now, though. She's no longer pregnant. She had given birth.
And she is still adamant that she had nothing to do with Sam's death, in spite of all of this information that points right smack at her.
I didn't kill him.
Who did? Who did?
She gets a little bit feisty and tells them, doesn't matter what I say, you're still going to point your fingers at me.
How can you say the person I killed him? How can you tell me I killed him?
Shara can deny it all she wants. But when she goes on trial for murder in February of 2008, the prosecution argues that she shot Sam because he was planning to leave her for another woman.
It was the prosecutor's position that in Shara's mind, if Samuel was not going to be with her, he was not going to be with anyone.
And on July 23rd, while Sam was asleep, she took his gun from the drawer in the night table beside the bed.
She shot him cold-blooded. And then she decides, now how am I going to hide the evidence?
She covered the body when the complex sent someone over to repair the window that they noticed had been shattered.
Then in an effort to establish her alibi, she went over with her sister, came back to the house, set it on fire, and then left.
So all of this was done by design.
When it's the defense's turn, Shara's attorneys admit that she was involved in stealing Sam's SUV and gun, but insist there's no proof she was the shooter.
There was no DNA. There were no witnesses. There was nothing that pointed the finger to Shara. The defense attorney claims that it was someone else that actually shot Samuel in the head and that Shara had nothing to do with it.
The argument carries at least some weight with the jury.
She was not convicted of first-degree murder because the jury could not agree that she was the one that actually pulled the trigger.
But that doesn't mean they believe she's innocent.
The jury found Shara Cooper guilty of second-degree murder with a firearm, first-degree arson, and grand theft.
The judge sentences her to life in prison.
However, 4 years later, her conviction is overturned.
Shara and her attorneys successfully argued that she had ineffective counsel. So the appellate court remanded the case back to court.
But the district attorney decides not to risk a second trial.
The prosecutors decide to approach Shara with a plea offer, and Shara accepts a plea of manslaughter.
Under the plea deal, she's sentenced to 30 years in prison.
I do think that justice was served with that resolution.
But to some, it means Shara will get away with the cold-blooded murder of a young man with big ambitions.
Shara was able to escape second-degree murder on a technicality, essentially, and then she's able to negotiate for a lesser charge. So I don't know if Shara got the full extent of punishment for taking Sam's life.
She knew what she was doing. She had a plan. She thought she could get away with it. She didn't care about Sam.
I don't think justice will ever fully be served because he's not able to come back and pursue those goals that he set out to do.
All that remains are memories of Sam Norris and the daughter he never got to meet, born after he was murdered.
We have an innocent child that has lost not only her father, but her mother as well.
She has no memory of her dad, but I hope she's spoken to those who do so that she can know him through the people whose lives he touched.
Between the end of 1989 and the end of 1990, 7 men disappeared or were found dead across Florida, their lives suddenly intersecting with the same woman, Aileen Carol Wuornos. 6 of those deaths would eventually become murder convictions. One man, Peter Seams, would remain missing, his body never recovered. Wuornos herself admitted that she had killed all 7 men, but the story she gave about why she had killed them was never as simple as the number of victims suggested. At different points, she said that she had been attacked, that men had tried to rape her, and that she had shot them because she believed she was defending her own life. Prosecutors presented a different picture. They argued that the killings were deliberate and that Wuornos had taken money and property from the men afterward. The courts ultimately rejected her claims of self-defense in the cases that resulted in convictions. Yet even after the trials, one question remained particularly difficult to answer. What exactly happened during the final moments between Wuornos and each of these men? The answer was not preserved in photographs, recordings, or eyewitness testimony from the victims themselves. In several cases, investigators had to reconstruct events from physical evidence, vehicles, possessions, gunshot evidence, statements, and Wuornos' own changing accounts. And in the case of Peter Seams, there was not even a body. That distinction matters. In a case that has become surrounded by documentaries, books, films, and public fascination, it can be easy to forget that there were actually 3 different versions of the story. What could be established through evidence in court proceedings, what Wuornos herself said, and what could never be known with certainty. This is the story of those 3 versions, and of the 7 men whose deaths brought them together. Aileen Wuornos was born on February 29, 1956 in Rochester, Michigan. Her childhood was deeply unstable. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, had been convicted of sexual offenses against children and died in prison. Her mother left when Wuornos was young, and she and her brother were raised by their grandparents. As a teenager, Wuornos left home and began living a life marked by instability. Eventually, she moved to Florida, where she survived through different means, including prostitution along the state's highways. The highways would later become central to the investigation. Wuornos would approach drivers and sometimes enter their vehicles, placing her in circumstances where encounters with strangers could happen quickly and away from witnesses. She also carried a gun, according to the supplied court record, which she said was for protection. During this period, Wuornos was in a relationship with Tyria Moore. The 2 women lived together for approximately 4.5 years. Moore worked as a maid, while Wuornos primarily supported herself through prostitution. Their relationship would later become one of the most important elements in the investigation, because Moore became the person through whom investigators were eventually able to reach Wuornos and obtain information about the killings. But before that breakthrough, there was a first victim. Richard Charles Mallory was 51 years old. He worked in the electronics field and was traveling through Central Florida when his life crossed paths with Wuornos. On December 1, 1989, a police officer discovered Mallory's vehicle abandoned in Volusia County. Mallory was nowhere to be found. 13 days later, on December 13th, his body was discovered in a wooded area several miles away. The autopsy showed that Mallory had been shot multiple times. 2 bullets had struck his left lung, causing hemorrhage that resulted in his death. The court record also noted that Mallory had consumed alcohol before his death. At first, the discovery could have been treated as an isolated homicide. But according to the court record, Wuornos later returned to the motel and told Tyria Moore that she had shot a man. She described taking some of the man's possessions and leaving other items behind. His vehicle was abandoned near Ormond Beach, while his body was left in a wooded area. That account would become an important piece of the prosecution's case. But Wuornos later offered another explanation. She said Mallory had attacked and raped her, and that she had shot him in self-defense. That claim would become one of the defining issues of the entire case. Was Wuornos describing a genuine act of survival? Or was the self-defense story an attempt to explain a deliberate killing? The court ultimately rejected the self-defense argument. Wuornos was convicted of first-degree murder in Mallory's death and sentenced to death. But Richard Mallory would not remain an isolated name in an investigation for long. In May 1990, David Andrew Spears, 47, was found dead in Pasco County after disappearing. He had been shot with a small-caliber firearm. Investigators began noticing similarities between his death and Mallory's. Both victims were men. Both had become connected to automobiles and isolated locations. Both had disappeared before their bodies were found. Both had died from gunshot wounds. As investigators examined the circumstances surrounding the deaths, the possibility emerged that these were not separate crimes at all. Then, in June, another man disappeared. Charles Edmund Carskaddon Jr., 40, was reported missing in early June, and his body was found on June 6th. Again, investigators encountered the same troubling combination of elements: a male victim, a vehicle, property, a disappearance, and a body found away from the ordinary places where a person would expect to find someone who had simply vanished. The individual cases were beginning to resemble pieces of the same puzzle. Wuornos later pleaded guilty to Carskaddon's killing. By then, the investigation was no longer simply about determining who had killed one man. Investigators were beginning to ask whether a single person was moving through Florida's highways and repeatedly encountering men under similar circumstances. And the answer would soon lead them toward a woman who had been living on the margins of society, carrying a firearm, working along the roads, and living with Tyria Moore. But the investigation still had a long way to go. One of the most important pieces of the case had not yet been found. It was not a weapon, a confession, or a vehicle. It was a man who had simply disappeared. His name was Peter Abraham Seams. He was 65 years old. And unlike the other men, Peter Seams would leave behind no body to tell investigators how his story ended. His disappearance would become the unanswered question at the center of the case. To understand the Aileen Wuornos case, it is necessary to begin before the bodies were discovered along Florida's roads, before investigators began connecting separate homicide cases, and before the name Aileen Wuornos became known across the country. The woman at the center of the investigation had not appeared suddenly in Florida in 1989. Her life had already been marked by instability for decades. Aileen Carol Wuornos was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. Her childhood was deeply unsettled. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, had been convicted of sexual offenses against children and later died in prison. Her mother left when Wuornos was young. She and her brother were subsequently raised by their grandparents. These facts became part of the public discussion surrounding Wuornos many years later, particularly when questions arose about her mental health, her behavior, and the circumstances that had shaped her life. But they do not explain the murders by themselves, and they should not be treated as an excuse for what happened to the victims. They are simply part of the background that existed before the killings began. As a teenager, Wuornos left home and began living a transient life. Eventually, she moved to Florida, where she survived through different means, including prostitution along the state's highways. That occupation would become crucial to the circumstances of the later crimes. The highways provided a setting where Wuornos could encounter strangers without established relationships, without people around who knew either person, and without the normal routines that might connect one person to another. She would approach drivers and sometimes enter their vehicles. In the later investigation, that recurring circumstance became one of the central features connecting the victims to her. The encounters did not begin with a long history between Wuornos and the men who would later become homicide victims. Instead, the relationships were often brief, beginning on or around the roads of Florida and ending in circumstances that investigators would eventually have to reconstruct. Wuornos also carried a firearm. According to the Florida court record supplied for this case, she carried the gun for protection. That fact would later become especially significant because every one of the 6 murder convictions involved a shooting, The presence of the firearm, therefore, became part of a much larger question, whether it was carried primarily as a means of protection, as Wuornos maintained, or whether it became an instrument of deliberate killing, as prosecutors argued. The answer to that question would ultimately be determined in court, but the question itself existed long before the trials began. During these years, another person occupied an important place in Wuornos' life, Tyria Moore. Wuornos and Moore were in a relationship and lived together for approximately 4.5 years. Moore worked as a maid, while Wuornos primarily supported herself through prostitution. Their relationship would later become one of the most important threads in the entire investigation. At the beginning, however, there was nothing to indicate that Moore would one day become a central figure in a major homicide investigation. She was simply the person closest to Wuornos, the person with whom she shared her life, and to whom she could return after encounters on the road. That closeness would eventually make Moore a crucial witness to what Wuornos said after some of the killings. It would also make her the person investigators would use to reach Wuornos when the investigation finally began closing in. But before that happened, there was a first known victim. Richard Charles Mallory was 51 years old and worked in the electronics field. His death in late 1989 would become the first known killing in the sequence eventually associated with Wuornos. On December 1, 1989, a police officer discovered Mallory's vehicle abandoned in Volusia County. Mallory himself was missing. At that moment, investigators did not yet have the larger picture. They had a vehicle without its owner, but they did not know that the disappearance would eventually become connected to a series of killings. 13 days later, on December 13th, Mallory's body was discovered in a wooded area several miles away. The autopsy provided the first concrete evidence of what had happened to him. Mallory had been shot multiple times. 2 of the bullets had struck his left lung, causing hemorrhage that resulted in his death. The court record also noted that he had consumed alcohol before his death. The physical evidence established that Mallory had been killed by gunfire, but it could not, by itself, tell investigators everything that had happened immediately before those shots were fired. That missing portion of the story would later become the subject of competing accounts. According to the court record, Wuornos returned to the motel after the incident and told Tyria Moore that she had shot a man. She described taking some of the man's possessions and leaving other items behind. The vehicle was abandoned near Ormond Beach, while the body was left in a wooded area. Those statements would become important because they connected Wuornos to the death through her own words. But the version of events that she later presented was different in a critical respect. Wuornos said that Mallory had attacked and raped her, and that she had shot him in self-defense. That claim would follow her through the investigation and into the courtroom. It also introduced the central conflict that would define the case: the difference between what Wuornos said had happened inside the vehicle and what prosecutors argued had happened. If her account were accepted, the shooting could be understood as an act committed in response to an immediate threat. If the prosecution's account were accepted, the killing was part of a deliberate pattern involving murder and the taking of property. The courts ultimately rejected Wuornos' self-defense argument in the case that became the foundation of her prosecution. She was convicted of first-degree murder in Mallory's death and sentenced to death. But at the time of Mallory's killing, there was no reason for investigators to know that his death would be followed by more. Months later, David Andrew Spears, 47, was found dead in Pasco County after disappearing. He had been shot with a small-caliber firearm. The similarities began to accumulate. Another man had disappeared. Another man had been shot. Another body had been found away from the ordinary circumstances of daily life. The investigation was beginning to change in character. A homicide detective looking at Mallory's death alone could focus on Mallory. A detective looking at Spears could focus on Spears. But when the circumstances of both cases were placed beside each other, the possibility of a connection became harder to ignore. Then came Charles Edmund Carskadden Jr., 40. He disappeared in early June 1990 and his body was found on June 6th. Again, investigators encountered the combination of a male victim, a disappearance, a vehicle, property, and a body discovered in a more isolated location. Wuornos later pleaded guilty to Karskadden's killing. The number of cases was growing, and with every new death, the investigators' task became more difficult and more urgent. They were no longer simply asking who had killed one person. They were beginning to confront the possibility that the same individual was repeatedly encountering men along Florida's highways and that these encounters were ending in death. Yet the person behind the pattern remained unidentified. There was still no complete picture of how the victims met Wuornos, what happened inside their vehicles, or why the encounters ended with gunshots. The eventual investigation would have to reconstruct those moments from scattered evidence. Vehicles, property, firearms, statements, and the testimony of people connected to Wuornos. And then there was another disappearance that would complicate everything further. In June 1990, 65-year-old Peter Abraham seems vanished during an automobile trip. His Pontiac would eventually provide investigators with a significant link to Wuornos. But Peter seems himself would never be found. There would be no body, no autopsy, and no physical examination capable of establishing exactly how he died. His disappearance would therefore occupy a different place in the case from the 6 deaths that produced murder convictions. By the time investigators began to understand that distinction, Aileen Wuornos was already moving through a sequence of events that would eventually lead to her arrest, her trial, 6 death sentences, and ultimately her execution. But none of that had happened yet. At this point, the investigation was still unfolding. The victims were still separate names in separate files, and the woman who connected them was still somewhere on Florida's roads. The pattern existed, but its full shape had not yet been revealed. Richard Charles Mallory was 51 years old when his life became the first known chapter in the series of killings eventually attributed to Aileen Wuornos. At the time, there was no reason for anyone investigating his disappearance to know that his name would later be placed beside 6 other men. There was no established pattern yet, no identified suspect, and no reason to believe that the death of one man in Central Florida was connected to a larger sequence of homicides. For investigators, Mallory was initially a single missing person whose abandoned vehicle raised questions that could not immediately be answered. For his family and those who knew him, the disappearance was something more immediate. A man had simply failed to return, and no one yet knew why. Mallory worked in the electronics field and was traveling through Central Florida in late 1989. On December 1st, a police officer discovered his vehicle abandoned in Volusia County. Mallory was not inside. The discovery transformed an absence into a potential crime scene. A vehicle without its owner could mean many things, but as time passed, the circumstances became more troubling. Mallory had not simply left his vehicle and disappeared from ordinary life. 13 days later, on December 13th, his body was found in a wooded area several miles from where the vehicle had been abandoned. The location immediately separated the disappearance into 2 places, the vehicle in one location and the body in another. That separation would become important in understanding the broader pattern that investigators eventually discovered. The body provided the first firm evidence that Mallory's disappearance had ended in homicide. The autopsy showed that he had been shot multiple times. 2 bullets had struck his left lung, causing hemorrhage that resulted in his death. The court record also noted that Mallory had consumed alcohol before his death. Those findings established how he died, but they did not answer the most important questions surrounding the moments before the shooting. Who had been with him? What had happened inside the vehicle? Why had his body been left in a wooded area? And why had his vehicle been abandoned somewhere else? At this stage, the investigation did not yet have the answers. The eventual prosecution would depend heavily on evidence that connected Aileen Wuornos to Mallory, and on statements attributed to Wuornos herself. According to the court record supplied for this case, after returning to the motel on December 1st, Wuornos told Tyria Moore that she had shot a man. That statement became significant because Moore was not a distant acquaintance. She was Wuornos's partner, and the two women had lived together for approximately 4.5 years. Wuornos described taking some of the man's possessions and leaving other items behind. She also described the vehicle being abandoned near Ormond Beach, while the body was left in a wooded area. The account created a connection between Wuornos and the events surrounding Mallory's death that investigators could examine against the physical evidence. But there was another version of the encounter, one that Wuornos would rely upon in her defense. She said Mallory had attacked and raped her and that she had shot him in self-defense. This was not a minor disagreement over motive. It was the dividing line between two completely different interpretations of the same death. Under Wuornos's account, the shooting occurred because she believed she was in immediate danger. Under the prosecution's theory, the killing was deliberate and connected to the taking of property. The court ultimately rejected Wuornos's self-defense argument. That legal conclusion is important, but it should not erase the distinction between what the physical evidence established and what remained dependent on competing accounts. The autopsy could establish that Mallory had been shot and that the gunshot injuries caused his death. It could not, by itself, describe the exact conversation or confrontation that preceded those shots. Those circumstances had to be reconstructed through the evidence presented during the investigation and trial. Mallory's death, therefore, became more than the first homicide in the sequence. It became the first test of the story that Wuornos would tell about the killings. If she had truly been attacked, then the circumstances would have to be understood through the framework of self-defense. If prosecutors were correct, then the shooting represented a deliberate act followed by the removal of property and abandonment of the vehicle and body. The court sided with the prosecution's interpretation. Wuornos was convicted of first-degree murder for Mallory's death and sentenced to death. But the significance of Mallory's case would not become fully apparent until months later. At the time of his death, there was no obvious reason to place his case beside the disappearance of another Florida man. Yet in May 1990, David Andrew Spears, 47, was found dead in Pasco County after disappearing. Spears had also been shot, reportedly with a small-caliber firearm. The similarities were not proof by themselves, but they were enough to make investigators look more closely. A man had disappeared. A man had been found dead. A firearm had been involved. And once investigators began comparing cases rather than viewing each death in isolation, the possibility of a larger pattern emerged. The significance of Mallory's case therefore changed. It was no longer simply a homicide investigation with a suspect eventually brought before a jury. It became the first known point on a timeline that would extend through 1990. In June, Charles Edmund Carskaddon Jr., 40, disappeared. His body was found on June 6th. Again, investigators were confronted by a male victim, a disappearance, a vehicle or property connection, and a body located away from the ordinary places associated with the victim's daily life. Wuornos later pleaded guilty to Carskaddon's killing. With 3 deaths now connected to the emerging investigation, the possibility that the cases were related became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Yet the investigators still faced a fundamental problem. The pattern could be recognized before the person responsible could be identified. The highway environment provided countless encounters between strangers. Vehicles moved through different jurisdictions. Bodies could be left in isolated locations. Property could be separated from the victims. Each individual case had its own circumstances, but the similarities between them suggested that investigators needed to think beyond individual crime scenes. Mallory's death had become the beginning of that pattern. The abandoned vehicle, the wooded location, the gunshot wounds, the property, and Wuornos's own statement to Moore would later be examined alongside evidence from other killings. At the same time, Wuornos's self-defense claim would remain one of the most controversial elements of the case. She maintained that men had attacked or attempted to sexually assault her, and that she had responded with lethal force because she believed her life was threatened. Prosecutors rejected that explanation, pointing to the broader circumstances of the killings and the disappearance of victims' property. The court ultimately rejected the self-defense defense in the cases that resulted in convictions. But the question of what exactly happened in the moments before each shooting would remain tied to the accounts available to investigators. There were no surviving victims who could describe the encounters from the other side. That absence would become increasingly important as the number of deaths grew. Mallory's case was the first. It provided the beginning of the timeline and eventually the first conviction. But it was only after Spears and Carskaddon that investigators could begin to see something larger taking shape. Then came another name. Peter Abraham seems 65 years old. His disappearance in June 1990 would create one of the most difficult questions in the entire investigation. Unlike Mallory, Spears, and Carskaddon, Seams would never be found. His Pontiac would survive. Evidence connected to the vehicle would survive. Wuornos would eventually admit involvement. But Peter Seams himself would remain absent. And without a body, the investigation would enter a different kind of uncertainty. By then, however, the pattern was becoming clearer. Men were disappearing along Florida's roads, and their deaths were increasingly being connected to the same woman. Richard Mallory had been the first known victim. His case had begun with an abandoned car and a missing man. It would eventually end with a first-degree murder conviction and a death sentence for Aileen Wuornos. But the investigation was far from finished. The next cases would multiply the evidence, deepen the controversy over motive, and bring investigators closer to understanding who was responsible for the deaths. By the time investigators began looking beyond the death of Richard Mallory, the most disturbing feature of the case was no longer simply that a man had been shot. It was the possibility that Mallory's death might not have been an isolated event. In May 1990, another Florida man disappeared, and investigators were confronted with circumstances that began to resemble what they had already seen. His name was David Andrew Spears. He was 47 years old, and his death would become the second murder in the sequence eventually attributed to Aileen Wuornos. Spears was found dead in Pasco County after disappearing. He had been shot with a small-caliber firearm. At first glance, one homicide did not automatically establish a connection to another. Florida was a large state, and violent crimes occurred for many different reasons. But investigators examining Spears' death already had the earlier case involving Richard Mallory in the back of their minds. Mallory had disappeared, his vehicle had been abandoned, and his body had later been discovered in a wooded area. He had died from multiple gunshot wounds. Now another man had disappeared and been found dead from gunfire. The similarity did not prove that the same person was responsible, but it created a reason to compare the cases more carefully. The investigation began to move from individual incidents toward a larger question. Were these men victims of separate crimes, or were their deaths connected? The answer would gradually emerge through a collection of circumstances rather than one single piece of evidence. The men were male. Their encounters were associated with travel and automobiles. Their bodies were found after they disappeared. Gunfire was involved. Property and vehicles became important parts of the investigation. And, most significantly, the deaths occurred within a relatively short period of time. The pattern was beginning to take shape, although investigators did not yet have a name to place at its center. Then, in June 1990, another man disappeared. His name was Charles Edmund Carskaddon Jr. He was 40 years old. Carskaddon disappeared in early June, and his body was discovered on June 6th. With Carskaddon, investigators once again confronted circumstances that resembled the earlier cases. There was a male victim, a disappearance, a vehicle or property connection, and a body found away from the ordinary circumstances of the victim's life. The growing similarities made it increasingly difficult to treat each homicide as an unrelated event. But recognizing a pattern and proving who created it were two very different tasks. Investigators still had to determine how the men had encountered their killer, what had happened during those encounters, and what evidence could connect the separate crime scenes to a single individual. This was especially difficult because the victims were dead. There was no surviving witness who could describe the final moments inside a vehicle. Investigators had to work backward from the evidence that remained. The abandoned automobiles became important. The property of the victims became important. The locations where bodies were found became important. And the accounts of people connected to the suspect would eventually become crucial. Wuornos later pleaded guilty to the killing of Karskaten. That admission added another direct connection between her and one of the deaths. But the investigation did not suddenly become simple. Instead, the number of cases continued to grow. Each new homicide increased the significance of the previous ones. Mallory was no longer simply a dead man whose vehicle had been found in Volusia County. Spears was no longer simply another shooting in Pasco County. Karskaten was no longer simply another missing person whose body had been recovered. Together, the cases suggested a sequence. And if the sequence was real, investigators needed to identify the common element linking it. That element would eventually be Aileen Wuornos. But at this stage, the case was still developing. Wuornos had been living in Florida and supporting herself primarily through prostitution along the highways. Her work placed her in repeated contact with men traveling in vehicles. She approached drivers and sometimes entered their cars. That circumstance would become central to the prosecution's theory because it provided a plausible setting in which strangers could meet without a prior relationship. It also became central to Wuornos' own explanation of the killings. She said that the men who picked her up attacked or attempted to sexually assault her, and that she shot them in self-defense. The prosecution would ultimately argue something very different, that the encounters were followed by deliberate killings and the taking of money or property. As the number of deaths increased, the difference between those two interpretations became more important. The investigation was no longer simply trying to answer the question of who had pulled the trigger. It was also trying to establish what happened before and after the shooting. If property had been taken, where did it go? If vehicles had been abandoned, who had driven them there? If Wuornos had told more about the killings, what exactly had she said? And could those statements be compared with the physical evidence? The answers would eventually form a case that went far beyond one confession. But before investigators could reach that point, another disappearance created an especially difficult problem. In June 1990, Peter Abraham Seams, 65, disappeared during an automobile trip. His case was different from the others because his body would never be recovered. Yet his Pontiac would become an important part of the investigation. The vehicle was involved in an accident, and investigators discovered evidence associated with Wuornos. Most significantly, a palm print linked to Wuornos was found in connection with the vehicle. That evidence gave investigators a physical connection between Wuornos and a missing man. But it could not answer every question. Without Seams's body, there was no autopsy to establish a cause of death. Without a body, there was no direct physical evidence proving precisely what had happened to him. Wuornos later admitted involvement in his death, but she was not convicted of murdering Seams. His disappearance would therefore remain one of the most important distinctions in the case. 7 men would eventually be associated with Wuornos, but only 6 deaths would produce murder convictions. The distinction was not merely technical. It reflected the limits of what the evidence could establish in court. By the middle of 1990, however, investigators had reason to believe that something much larger was happening. Mallory had been killed in late 1989. Spears was dead by May 1990. Karskaten was dead by June. Seams had disappeared in the same month. The incidents were accumulating rapidly. The men were not connected to one another by an obvious personal relationship. Instead, the apparent connection was the circumstances in which they encountered the same woman. That was what made the emerging pattern so unusual. A person traveling along Florida's roads could disappear, leaving behind a vehicle, property, and eventually a body in an isolated location. Investigators now had to determine whether they were looking at a series of crimes committed by one offender, or a collection of unrelated events that merely appeared similar. As more evidence accumulated, the first possibility became increasingly compelling. But there was still a long distance between suspicion and arrest. Investigators needed evidence that would survive scrutiny in court. They needed to connect Wuornos to the victims individually, not merely to a general pattern. They needed physical evidence, statements, property, vehicles, and information that could be traced back to particular killings. And they needed to understand the role of Tyria Moore, the woman closest to Wuornos. At this point, Moore was not yet the dramatic turning point she would later become. She was simply Wuornos' partner, the person with whom she had shared a life for years. Yet that relationship would soon become one of the most consequential facts in the investigation. Moore knew what Wuornos had told her. She had heard the account after Mallory's death. She was connected closely enough to Wuornos that investigators believe she might be able to provide information unavailable anywhere else. Meanwhile, the deaths continued. In July and August, another man named Troy Eugene Burress would disappear. In September, Charles Richard Dick Humphreys would become another victim. In November, Walter Gino Antonio would become the last of the 6 men whose deaths resulted in murder convictions. The pattern that had begun with Mallory would soon become unmistakable. But before investigators could fully understand it, they first had to follow the evidence from one crime scene to another. David Spears and Charles Carskaddon were important because they transformed the Mallory case from a single homicide into the beginning of a possible series. Peter Seams made the investigation more complicated because his body was missing. And with each new case, the central question became harder to avoid. Who was the person moving through Florida's highways, meeting these men, and leaving death behind? The answer was Aileen Wuornos. But investigators were not there yet. They were still assembling the pieces, one victim at a time. By June 1990, the investigation surrounding Aileen Wuornos had begun to take on a shape that investigators could no longer easily ignore. Richard Mallory was dead. David Spears was dead. Charles Carskaddon Jr. was dead. Each case contained similarities involving male victims, automobiles, disappearances, gunfire, and bodies discovered away from ordinary surroundings. Then another man disappeared. His name was Peter Abraham Seams. He was 65 years old, and his disappearance would become one of the most difficult pieces of the entire investigation because, unlike the other men eventually connected to Wuornos, Peter Seams left behind no body. His absence created a problem that would remain unresolved even after the rest of the case had reached the courtroom. Seams was traveling by automobile when he disappeared in June 1990. The circumstances surrounding his disappearance eventually brought investigators to his Pontiac, and that vehicle became one of the most important physical links between the missing man and Aileen Wuornos. The Pontiac did not simply disappear with Seams. It became involved in an accident, creating an opportunity for investigators to examine the vehicle and search for evidence that might explain what had happened. What they found did not provide a complete answer, but it did provide something investigators urgently needed: a physical connection to Wuornos. A palm print associated with Wuornos was found in connection with the vehicle. That detail mattered because it placed her in or around a car belonging to a man who had disappeared. It was not, by itself, a complete reconstruction of the crime. A palm print could establish a connection between a person and a vehicle, but it could not tell investigators exactly when the contact occurred, what had happened inside the car, or what became of the vehicle's owner afterward. Those questions became even more important because Peter Seams could not be found. There was no body to examine. There was no autopsy. There were no wounds that could be documented. There was no medical evidence capable of establishing a cause of death. In the other cases, the discovery of a body gave investigators a physical starting point. They could establish that a man had died, determine how he had died, and then work backward toward the circumstances. With Seams, investigators had to begin with disappearance. The man was gone. His vehicle had become part of an accident. and evidence connected Wuornos to that vehicle. But the precise sequence of events remained uncertain. Wuornos eventually admitted involvement in Siems's death. Her admission became another piece of the broader investigation, especially as her statements about the other killings were also examined. Yet the legal distinction remained important. Wuornos was not convicted of murdering Peter Siems. His body was never recovered, and without the body, the prosecution did not have the same kind of physical evidence available in the 6 homicide cases that resulted in convictions. This is one of the clearest places where the historical record must be separated from the mythology that later surrounded Wuornos. It is accurate to say that 7 deaths were attributed to her and that she admitted killing 7 men. It is also accurate to say that she was legally convicted of 6 murders. Peter Siems belongs to the space between those two statements. A missing man whose disappearance became connected to Wuornos, whose vehicle contained evidence associated with her, and whose fate was never established through a recovered body and homicide conviction. The uncertainty surrounding Siems did not make his disappearance less significant. In some ways, it made the case more difficult to understand. His absence created an open question in a sequence that otherwise seemed increasingly concrete. Investigators could look at Mallory's body. They could look at Spears' death. They could examine Karskadin's case. But with Siems, they had to reconstruct events without the central piece of physical evidence. The Pontiac became a kind of surviving witness, but it could only reveal fragments. It could show that Wuornos had a physical connection to the vehicle. It could not tell investigators the entire story of what had happened to the man who owned it. This distinction also became important when considering Wuornos's changing explanations of the killings. She maintained that the men she encountered had attacked or attempted to sexually assault her and that she had acted in self-defense. That explanation was central to her account of why the shootings occurred. At other points, however, her statements changed, and she made admissions that included the taking of property. Prosecutors used those changes to support their argument that the killings were not simply acts of defensive violence. Instead, they argued that Wuornos deliberately killed the men and took their possessions. In the Siems case, however, the lack of a body meant that some of the questions could never be tested in the same way as they could in the other cases. There was no autopsy to contradict or confirm Wuornos's description of what happened. There was no recovered body to establish a gunshot wound or another cause of death. The investigation, therefore, depended more heavily on the surviving evidence, particularly the Pontiac and the palm print. For a homicide investigator, this is a difficult position. A missing person case can become a homicide investigation when evidence points toward death. But proving exactly how that death occurred is another matter. The investigators had to determine what the available evidence could legitimately establish without filling the gaps with assumptions. The palm print was important because it connected Wuornos to Siems's vehicle. Wuornos's own statements were important because she admitted involvement in his death. But neither fact could produce the missing body. The uncertainty remained. At the same time, Siems's disappearance occurred within a growing sequence of deaths. That context changed the significance of every new piece of evidence. If Siems had disappeared in isolation, the investigation might have developed differently. But he disappeared after Mallory, Spears, and Karskadin had already become part of a disturbing pattern. His case therefore became another possible link in the same chain. The investigators were no longer examining one unexplained disappearance. They were examining a series of men whose lives had intersected with a woman living and working along Florida's highways. By this point, the emerging picture was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. Yet the investigation still lacked a final answer to the most basic question: who was responsible? The evidence was pointing toward Wuornos, but investigators needed to connect her to the individual deaths in a way that could withstand legal scrutiny. They needed more victims, more physical evidence, and more information about what Wuornos had said to people close to her. That last element would eventually become especially important. Tyria Moore was not merely Wuornos' partner. She was someone who had heard Wuornos discuss events after at least some of the killings. Her relationship with Wuornos would eventually provide investigators with an avenue into the case that physical evidence alone could not provide. But before more became the key to the breakthrough, another man would disappear. Troy Eugene Burress was 50 years old and worked as a delivery driver. His disappearance would occur around the end of July 1990, and his body would later be discovered in a wooded area. Like the men before him, Burress had been shot. By then, the pattern had become larger. What had begun with Richard Mallory was no longer a single homicide. David Spears and Charles Carskaddon had expanded it. Peter Seams had added a disappearance without a recovered body. Now Troy Burress would provide another death with circumstances that investigators could compare to the earlier cases. The investigation was moving toward a point where the repeated similarities would become increasingly difficult to explain as coincidence. But Peter Seams remained different. His name would always carry a question mark that the other cases did not. He had disappeared. His vehicle had been found. Evidence linked Wuornos to that vehicle. Wuornos admitted involvement in his death. Yet the man himself was never recovered. Decades later, that absence remains one of the most important boundaries around the case. It reminds us that not everything associated with a notorious criminal investigation can be reduced to a confirmed fact. Some elements are proven, some are admitted, some are inferred from evidence, and some remain unknown. Peter Seams belonged to that last category in a way none of the other victims did. His disappearance became part of the case against Wuornos, but it never became one of the 6 murder convictions. And as investigators continued following the trail left by the other victims, the question of Seams's fate remained unanswered. The Pontiac had survived. The evidence had survived. The investigation had moved forward. But Peter Seams himself had vanished, leaving behind one of the most enduring mysteries in the entire Wuornos case. The next victim would be Troy Burress. By then, investigators were beginning to see not merely a collection of deaths, but a recurring pattern that stretched across Florida. And with every additional killing, the possibility that one woman stood at the center of the pattern became stronger. By the summer of 1990, the investigation was no longer centered on a single unexplained homicide. Richard Mallory had been killed in late 1989. David Spears had been found dead in May. Charles Edmund Carskaddon Jr. had been found dead in June. Peter Seams had disappeared that same month, leaving behind a Pontiac and evidence connecting Aileen Wuornos to the vehicle, but no body. Each case added another piece to an increasingly disturbing picture. Then came Troy Eugene Burress. Burress was 50 years old and worked as a delivery driver. He disappeared around the end of July 1990, and on August 4th his body was discovered in a wooded area. The circumstances were familiar enough to immediately draw attention. Another man had disappeared. Another body had been found away from ordinary surroundings. Another shooting had taken place, and another vehicle associated with the victim had become part of the investigation. By itself, Burress's death might have been investigated as another homicide. But by August 1990, investigators had the advantage and the burden of knowing what had come before. They were no longer starting with an empty file. They had several earlier cases to compare. The question was becoming increasingly direct. Were the deaths of Mallory, Spears, Carskaddon, and Burress connected? And if they were, who was the person responsible? The repeated circumstances gave investigators a reason to believe that the answer might be found not in the victims' personal relationships, but in the circumstances under which they had encountered their killer. Wuornos had been working as a prostitute along Florida's highways. She approached drivers and sometimes entered their vehicles. That meant that the initial meeting between Wuornos and a victim could happen quickly and without a long-standing personal connection. The prosecution would later argue that this created an opportunity for a deliberate pattern of killing and theft. Wuornos would give a fundamentally different account. She maintained that men picked her up, took her into their vehicles, and attacked or attempted to sexually assault her. According to her version, she used her firearm because she believed she was in danger. By the time Burress's body was discovered, the dispute over motive was becoming inseparable from the investigation itself. Investigators were not simply asking who had shot the men. They were also examining what happened to their property after their deaths. In the developing prosecution theory, the disappearance of personal belongings and vehicles could help demonstrate that the killings involved more than immediate self-defense. Wuornos' statements about taking property also became important. Yet the investigators still needed to build connections between specific victims and specific evidence. Burress's case added another victim to the sequence, but the investigation remained a process of assembling separate pieces. The body provided evidence that Burress had died from gunfire. The circumstances of his disappearance and the location where he was found could be compared with the earlier cases. His vehicle and property became relevant to determining what happened after his disappearance. Each comparison strengthened the possibility that the same person was responsible for multiple deaths. The pattern was no longer defined by one similarity. It was defined by accumulation: a male victim, a disappearance, an automobile, a firearm, a body found in an isolated location, property connected to the victim, then another case with the same general structure, and another. The significance of Burress's death therefore came from its place in the sequence. It pushed the investigation beyond the possibility of coincidence. For known dead men were now connected by circumstances that investigators believed could point toward the same offender. While a fifth man, Peter Seams, remained missing. The number of cases made the investigation more urgent, but it also created a new problem. The investigators needed to identify the common person linking them. The answer would eventually come through several forms of evidence working together. There were the vehicles. There were the firearms and ballistic evidence. There were the victim's possessions. There was the palm print connected to Seams's Pontiac. And there were statements from Wuornos and eventually from Tyria Moore. But that evidence was not assembled overnight. At the time Burress was found, investigators were still following leads and comparing information from different jurisdictions. The deaths had occurred in different places, and the victims had different backgrounds. Yet the circumstances surrounding their final movements created a common thread. That thread led toward the roads. Wuornos' work placed her directly in the environment where these encounters could occur. She could meet a driver without any prior relationship. She could enter a vehicle. The driver could then become isolated from other witnesses. The prosecution later used this context to argue that the killings represented a pattern rather than a collection of isolated defensive incidents. The defense, by contrast, had to contend with Wuornos' account that the men had attacked her. The question would ultimately be resolved through the courts, but during the investigation it remained open. Investigators had to examine what evidence supported each side. One important problem was that the victims could not tell their stories. Every man who might have described the encounter was dead or missing. That meant the investigation depended on evidence left behind and on the statements of people who had heard Wuornos speak. Tyria Moore became especially important in this regard. She had lived with Wuornos for years and was close enough to hear what Wuornos said after the killings. According to the supplied case data, after the Mallory killing, Wuornos told Moore that she had shot a man. Such statements mattered because they potentially provided information that was not available from the physical crime scenes. But the investigators also needed to be careful about what could actually be established. A statement made by a suspect could connect her to an event, but it still had to be examined against other evidence. The eventual prosecution did not rest on one statement alone. It was built from multiple connections involving people, property, vehicles, ammunition, and Wuornos' own admissions. Burress's death came at a point when the investigation was gaining momentum, but the decisive breakthrough had not yet occurred. Investigators still did not have Wuornos in custody. They had not yet developed the strategy that would eventually bring her into contact with them. They had a growing number of cases and an increasingly specific profile of the person they believed. was responsible, but the suspect remained outside the formal reach of the investigation. Then in September, another victim would be added to the sequence. His name was Charles Richard Dick Humphreys. He was 56 years old and had a background that distinguished him from the other victims. Humphreys had worked as an Air Force security officer, a sheriff, and an investigator dealing with child abuse cases. His disappearance and death would add another layer to the investigation because his background meant that his absence could not easily be treated as an ordinary missing person case. He disappeared around September 11th, and the following day, 2 boys discovered his body in an isolated area. The autopsy revealed multiple gunshot wounds to his head and body, with the court record describing 7 gunshot injuries. His pockets had been turned inside out, and his vehicle and some property were missing. Those details would become especially significant because they strengthened the argument that the killings were connected not only by gunfire, but also by the removal of property. By September, the sequence was becoming difficult to overlook. The first death had occurred in late 1989. Several more had followed in rapid succession during 1990. Peter Seams remained missing. Burress was dead. Humphreys was now dead. Investigators were no longer looking at a handful of unrelated homicide files. They were looking at a series of men whose final encounters appeared to share a common structure. The case was moving toward the moment when investigators would finally connect the evidence to a specific suspect. But the most important question was still unanswered. How would they find Aileen Wuornos? The answer would not come from a dramatic discovery at a remote crime scene. It would come through the person who knew Wuornos best. Tyria Moore had been beside her for years. She knew the woman investigators were trying to identify. And as the pressure surrounding the investigation increased, Moore would become the link between the police investigation and Wuornos herself. Before that happened, however, one final victim would enter the sequence. Walter Gino Antonio, 62 years old, would be found dead in November 1990. His death would complete the series of 6 murders for which Wuornos would eventually receive death sentences. By then, the investigators would have a far clearer picture of what they were dealing with. The pattern that began with Richard Mallory had become a chain of deaths stretching across Florida. Troy Burress's murder was crucial because it demonstrated that the sequence had not ended after the first few cases. It was continuing. Each new victim made the connection stronger and the investigation more urgent. The question was no longer whether the deaths might be connected. It was how to prove who was responsible. And the answer was already closer than investigators realized. By September 1990, the investigation into the Florida killings had entered a new stage. What had begun with the death of Richard Mallory less than a year earlier had expanded into a sequence involving multiple men. Multiple locations, abandoned vehicles, stolen property, and gunshot deaths. David Spears was dead. Charles Carskaddon was dead. Peter Seams had disappeared without a recovered body. Troy Burress had been found dead in a wooded area. The similarities were becoming increasingly difficult for investigators to dismiss. Yet the person responsible remained outside police custody. Then another man disappeared. His name was Charles Richard Dick Humphreys. He was 56 years old, and unlike some of the other victims, Humphreys had a professional history connected to law enforcement and public safety. He had served as an Air Force security officer, worked as a sheriff, and later investigated cases involving child abuse. His background made his disappearance particularly striking. This was not simply a man whose life had been defined by the anonymity of the highway. Humphreys had spent part of his career investigating wrongdoing himself. Now, in September 1990, he would become the subject of a homicide investigation. Humphreys disappeared around September 11th. The following day, 2 boys discovered his body in an isolated area. The discovery provided investigators with another crime scene and another opportunity to compare the evidence with the growing sequence of killings. The circumstances were disturbing, but familiar. Humphreys had been shot multiple times. The court record described 7 gunshot injuries to his head and body. His pockets had been turned inside out, and his vehicle and some of his property were missing. Those details were significant because the investigation was increasingly examining not only how the victims died, but what happened to their belongings afterward. If a victim was killed and property subsequently disappeared, investigators could ask whether the removal of that property was part of the same sequence of events. For prosecutors, such evidence would later support the argument that the killings involved robbery rather than being isolated acts of self-defense. But at the investigative stage, every piece still had to be connected carefully. The death of Humphreys added another victim to the growing pattern. His professional background also emphasized an important reality of the investigation. The victims were not identical people. They came from different circumstances and had different lives. What appeared to connect them was the way their paths crossed with the same woman. Wuornos had been working as a prostitute along Florida's highways, approaching drivers and sometimes entering their vehicles. According to her later account, those encounters sometimes became violent because the men attacked or attempted to sexually assault her. She maintained that she had used her firearm because she believed she was defending herself. The prosecution offered another explanation. Prosecutors argued that Wuornos deliberately killed the men and took their money or property. Afterward, the court ultimately rejected her self-defense claims in the cases, resulting in convictions. But during the investigation, the question remained one of the central issues investigators had to examine. The evidence surrounding Humphreys became especially important because his pockets had been turned inside out and his property was missing. Those facts did not independently establish the entire motive for his death, but they became part of the larger body of evidence prosecutors would later use to argue that the killings had a financial component. The investigators were now dealing with a series that had become too large to view as a collection of unrelated cases. The deaths of Mallory, Spears, Carskaddon, Burress, and Humphreys formed a disturbing sequence, while the disappearance of Peter Seams remained another possible link. Yet the investigation still needed a final piece. The identity of the person responsible had to be established through evidence strong enough to withstand a criminal prosecution. That process was already moving forward through information concerning Wuornos and Tyria Moore. Wuornos and Moore had lived together for approximately 4.5 years. Moore was therefore not simply someone who had encountered Wuornos briefly. She was the person closest to her during the period when the killings occurred. According to the supplied case data, Wuornos had told Moore about the Mallory killing after returning to their motel. Such statements gave investigators a possible path into Wuornos's private world. The challenge was how to use that connection. Investigators eventually understood that Moore could be the person capable of obtaining further information from Wuornos. The police investigation would later use Moore to contact Wuornos while investigators monitored the interaction. This strategy would become the decisive turning point, but before it unfolded, one more victim would be added to the sequence. In November 1990, Walter Gino Antonio, 62, was found dead near a logging road. His death would become the final homicide in the sequence for which Wuornos was eventually convicted. Antonio had been shot with a .22 caliber firearm. According to the court record, he suffered 4 gunshot wounds to his back. His belongings also became part of the investigation. By this point, investigators had a chain of cases that extended across almost an entire year. The first known killing had occurred in late 1989. Then, through the spring, summer, and autumn of 1990, the deaths continued. Now, in November, another man was dead. Antonio's killing was important not simply because he was the final known victim in the sequence of 6 murder convictions, but because it completed a pattern that investigators could compare across multiple crime scenes. The same broad circumstances appeared again and again, men encountered on or around Florida's roads. Vehicles connected to the victims, shootings, bodies found in isolated places, and property that had disappeared. The accumulated evidence was becoming more powerful because it was no longer dependent on one victim or one crime scene. A single unusual circumstance might be explained away. Repeated similarities across several cases were much harder to dismiss. Investigators now had 6 dead men and 1 missing man connected, directly or indirectly, to the same suspect. But the case still had to be built one victim at a time. For each homicide, prosecutors would eventually need to establish that Wuornos was responsible. That meant presenting evidence specific to the individual death, while also showing the broader connections among the cases. The investigation was therefore moving toward 2 related goals: identify Wuornos and establish the evidence linking her to the individual victims. The role of physical evidence became increasingly important. Firearms and ammunition could connect shootings. Vehicles could establish where a victim's property had gone and whether Wuornos had been in contact with it. Personal possessions could reveal what happened after a killing. Fingerprint evidence connected Wuornos to Peter Siems's Pontiac. Her own statements could provide information that investigators could compare against the physical evidence. And more could provide information about what Wuornos had told her. None of these elements needed to stand alone. Together, they could create a chain of connections. The investigation had reached a point where the question was no longer simply whether a serial killer might be operating in Florida. Investigators increasingly believed they knew the identity of that killer. What they did not yet have was the final bridge between suspicion and arrest. That bridge would come through Tyria Moore. As news of the killing spread, Moore became increasingly frightened by the possibility that she and Wuornos were being sought. She eventually left Florida and returned north. Investigators were able to contact her in Pennsylvania. Moore agreed to return to Florida, and police developed a plan to use her relationship with Wuornos to obtain information. The strategy depended on something investigators believed was stronger than pressure from the police: Wuornos' emotional connection to Moore. Moore would contact her, while investigators listened. The purpose was to encourage Wuornos to talk about what had happened. This was a crucial moment because the investigation was moving away from the crime scenes and toward the suspect herself. The police already had a substantial collection of evidence, but they needed information that could connect the separate pieces. Wuornos' own words could potentially provide that link. As Moore made contact, Wuornos began discussing the killings. Her statements helped investigators develop a picture of the sequence of events and connect her to multiple victims. The significance of this moment cannot be overstated. For months, investigators had been looking at bodies, vehicles, weapons, property, and missing persons. Now they had an opportunity to hear directly from the woman at the center of the investigation. Yet even then, the case would remain complicated by the changing explanations Wuornos gave for the killings. She admitted responsibility, but she continued to offer different accounts of why she had shot the men. At times, she described the killings as acts of self-defense against men who had attacked or attempted to rape her. At other times, her statements included admissions involving robbery and the taking of property. Investigators would have to separate the fact of her admissions from the question of how much of each account could be verified. By the end of 1990, the sequence had reached its final known killing with Walter Antonio. 6 men were dead, 1 man was missing, and the investigation was finally closing in on the woman whose name connected them. The next stage would be the arrests, the evidence, and the long legal process that followed. But before the trials could begin, investigators still had to transform a collection of disturbing circumstances into a prosecutable case. Tyria Moore had become the key to that transformation, and Aileen Wuornos was about to find herself at the center of one of the most closely watched criminal investigations in Florida. By the end of 1990, investigators were no longer searching for an explanation for a single homicide. They were confronting a sequence of deaths that had accumulated over approximately 1 year. Richard Mallory, David Spears, Charles Carskadden Jr., Troy Burress, Charles Richard Dick Humphreys, and Walter Gino Antonio were dead, while Peter Siems remained missing. The cases shared enough similarities to suggest that they were connected, and evidence had increasingly pointed toward one woman, Aileen Wuornos. But suspicion was not the same as proof. Investigators still needed to connect Wuornos to the individual victims and establish a case that could survive in court. The breakthrough would come through the person who knew Wuornos most closely, Tyria Moore. Moore and Wuornos had lived together for approximately 4.5 years. During that time, Moore was not simply a witness to Wuornos' life from a distance. She was her partner and someone to whom Wuornos spoke about events occurring in her life. According to the case record, after the killing of Richard Mallory, Wuornos returned to the motel and told Moore that she had shot a man. That statement would later become one of the important pieces of the investigation because it indicated that Wuornos had discussed a killing with someone close to her shortly after it occurred. The significance of Moore's role grew as the number of suspected victims increased. Investigators had physical evidence, vehicles, property, ammunition, and other links, but Moore potentially possessed something none of those objects could provide: information about Wuornos' own words. If investigators could establish what Wuornos had told Moore, they could compare those statements with the physical evidence already collected from the cases. The challenge was getting Moore to cooperate. As media coverage increased and police attention focused on the killings, Moore became frightened. The investigation was no longer invisible. Authorities were looking for information about two women who might be connected to the deaths, and Moore understood that her relationship with Wuornos could place her close to the center of the investigation. She eventually left Florida and returned north. Investigators were able to locate her in Pennsylvania. Her location gave them an opportunity to approach the investigation differently. Instead of trying to find Wuornos first and then confront her with the evidence, investigators could use Moore's relationship with her to establish contact. Moore agreed to return to Florida and cooperate with authorities. What followed became one of the most important investigative strategies in the entire case. Investigators arranged for Moore to contact Wuornos while police monitored the communication. The purpose was not simply to ask Wuornos whether she had committed the killings. Investigators wanted her to speak naturally about what had happened. They already had a growing body of evidence. What they needed was information that could help connect the pieces. Moore's role was therefore central. She was someone Wuornos trusted, someone with whom she had shared years of her life, and someone who could potentially draw out information that Wuornos might not volunteer to police. As Moore contacted Wuornos, the conversation gradually turned toward the killings. Wuornos began discussing what had happened. Her statements provided investigators with information concerning the sequence of events and helped connect her to multiple victims. The importance of those statements was that they did not exist in isolation. Investigators could compare them with what they already knew. A vehicle could be checked against Wuornos' account. Property could be traced. Ballistic evidence could be examined. Fingerprint evidence could be compared. The locations associated with victims could be placed alongside the information Wuornos provided. The investigation was becoming a process of cross-checking. If Wuornos described something that matched physical evidence already known to investigators, the statement became more significant. If she provided information that corresponded to circumstances surrounding a victim's disappearance, it created another connection. In this way, the case against her developed through accumulation rather than through a single dramatic revelation. The role of Tyria Moore also revealed one of the most complicated dimensions of the case. Moore was not simply a witness who happened to know Wuornos. She was Wuornos' partner. Their relationship meant that the investigation involved personal trust as well as criminal evidence. Wuornos had spent years with Moore, and that closeness was precisely what investigators used to obtain information. The police understood that Wuornos might speak to Moore in ways she would not speak to an investigator. That difference made Moore's cooperation potentially decisive. At the same time, investigators had to distinguish between Wuornos' admissions and the explanation she gave for them. Wuornos acknowledged that she had killed men, but she maintained that the circumstances were not what prosecutors later claimed. Her central explanation was self-defense. She said that men who picked her up while she was working as a prostitute attacked or attempted to sexually assault her. and that she shot them because she believed she was in danger. The prosecution would eventually argue that the killings were deliberate and connected to robbery. The statements obtained through Moore became part of the broader effort to determine which interpretation was supported by the evidence. One of the most important problems investigators faced was that the victims could not provide their own accounts. There were no surviving victims who could tell investigators what happened inside the vehicles. The prosecution therefore had to rely on physical evidence and statements from the suspect and people around her. This made the consistency of the evidence especially important. A single statement could be challenged. A physical item could be interpreted in different ways. But when several independent pieces of evidence pointed toward the same person, the overall case became stronger. Investigators had already developed several such links. Wuornos's palm print had been connected to Peter Siems's Pontiac. Property associated with victims became part of the investigation. Ballistic evidence connected firearms and ammunition to shootings. Wuornos's own statements provided information about the killings. Moore's cooperation created another source through which those statements could be examined. The investigators were gradually building a network rather than relying on one strand. The case also demonstrated why the disappearance of Peter Siems remained legally different. Wuornos's connection to his Pontiac was significant, and she admitted involvement in his death. But Siems's body was never recovered. The absence of a body limited what prosecutors could establish beyond reasonable doubt. The other 6 men had bodies, allowing investigators to document gunshot wounds and other physical evidence. Siems did not. This distinction would remain important when the case reached court. By the time investigators were using Moore to contact Wuornos, they had enough information to understand that the investigation was no longer speculative. The evidence was pointing toward a single suspect whose statements could be compared with the physical circumstances of several deaths. The remaining task was to bring that suspect into custody. The investigation's focus therefore shifted from identifying a possible offender to locating and arresting Aileen Wuornos. The cooperation of Moore was crucial to that process. Wuornos's trust in her partner had opened a door that investigators had previously been unable to open. Through Moore, investigators could communicate with Wuornos and obtain statements about the killings. Those statements helped establish a connection between Wuornos and the victims, but they also revealed the contradictions that would later become central to the legal proceedings. Wuornos could admit responsibility while disputing the circumstances. She could acknowledge taking property while maintaining that the shootings themselves were defensive. For investigators, the challenge was not simply to prove that she had been involved. It was to determine how the killings occurred and what motive the evidence supported. The prosecution would later argue that the circumstances demonstrated intentional murder and robbery. Wuornos would continue to emphasize self-defense. Those competing narratives would follow her from the investigation into the courtroom. But before that happened, police had to complete the arrest and gather the evidence into a prosecutable case. The breakthrough involving Moore brought them much closer. What had begun with an abandoned vehicle belonging to Richard Mallory had developed into a multi-victim investigation involving 6 confirmed murders and 1 unresolved disappearance. The investigators now had a suspect, a partner willing to cooperate, physical evidence connecting Wuornos to victims and vehicles, and statements that could be compared against the crime scenes. The mystery was no longer simply who might be responsible. Aileen Wuornos had become the central figure in the investigation. The next stage would be the arrests, the formal charges, and the preparation for trials that would determine whether the evidence gathered by investigators was enough to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The Florida highway killings had moved from the roadside and the wooded areas where the victims were found into police interrogation rooms and court files. And soon, the question would no longer be asked only by investigators. It would be placed before a jury. By the end of 1990, the investigation had reached the point where Aileen Wuornos was no longer simply a name appearing at the edges of several homicide files. The evidence had begun to converge on her. 6 men were dead, Peter Seams remained missing, and investigators had accumulated a combination of physical evidence, property connections, firearm evidence, and statements that linked Wuornos to the sequence. The cooperation of Tyria Moore had provided investigators with a way to communicate with Wuornos and obtain information about the killings. Her statements, however, did not provide a simple explanation. Wuornos admitted killing the men, but she continued to describe the encounters in terms of self-defense. She claimed that the men had attacked or attempted to sexually assault her, and that she had fired her weapon because she believed her life was in danger. Prosecutors would eventually present a fundamentally different interpretation, that Wuornos deliberately killed the men and took their money or property. That conflict over motive and intent would follow the case into the courtroom. The legal process began with the question of whether the evidence gathered during the investigation was sufficient to establish Wuornos' responsibility for individual murders. The prosecution did not have to prove that every detail of every encounter was known. Instead, the cases were built from the evidence available for each victim. Physical evidence connected Wuornos to certain vehicles and objects. Ballistic evidence linked ammunition and firearms to shootings. Property associated with victims became part of the investigation. Her own statements connected her to the killings. Information provided through Tyria Moore helped investigators understand what Wuornos had said after the crimes. Together, these elements formed the foundation for the prosecutions. The first major trial concerned Richard Mallory, the 51-year-old man whose body had been discovered in December 1989. Mallory's death was the beginning of the sequence of confirmed murders. His body had been found in a wooded area after his vehicle was discovered abandoned. The medical evidence established that he had been shot multiple times, with 2 bullets entering his left lung and causing fatal hemorrhaging. Wuornos' statements about Mallory became particularly important. According to the case record, after returning to the motel on December 1st, she told Tyria Moore that she had shot a man. The prosecution used this and other evidence to connect Wuornos to Mallory's death. Wuornos' defense, however, centered on self-defense. She claimed that Mallory had attacked and raped her, and that she had shot him because she believed she was in danger. The prosecution rejected that account and argued that the killing was intentional. The jury was therefore confronted with 2 competing versions of the same event. One portrayed Wuornos as a woman reacting violently to an assault. The other portrayed her as the aggressor in a deliberate killing connected to the taking of property. The jury ultimately rejected the self-defense explanation. In January 1992, Wuornos was convicted of first-degree murder in the Mallory case. During the penalty phase, the jury voted unanimously 12-0 for the death penalty. On January 31, 1992, the judge imposed the death sentence. The verdict established the first of the 6 murder convictions that would ultimately define Wuornos' legal record. But the prosecution did not stop with Mallory. The remaining cases were brought forward separately, with prosecutors presenting evidence concerning David Spears, Charles Carskadden Jr., Troy Burress, Charles Richard Dick Humphreys, and Walter Gino Antonio. The cases shared important similarities, but each had to be considered in its own legal context. David Spears, 47, had been found dead after disappearing in May 1990. He had been shot. His death became part of the growing pattern that investigators had identified. Charles Carskadden Jr., 40, was killed in June. His case included evidence involving his vehicle and property, and Wuornos eventually admitted responsibility for the killing. Troy Burress, 50, disappeared around the end of July, and his body was found on August 4th in a wooded area. He had been shot. Charles Humphreys, 56, disappeared around September 11th. His body was found the next day, and the court record described 7 gunshot wounds to his head and body. His pockets had been turned inside out, and his vehicle and property were missing. Walter Antonio, 62, was the final confirmed victim in the sequence. His body was found in November near a logging road. He had suffered 4 gunshot wounds to his back from a .22 caliber firearm. The prosecution used the similarities among these cases to support its argument that the killings were part of a deliberate pattern. The victims were men Wuornos had encountered while working along Florida's highways. Their vehicles and belongings became relevant after their deaths. Their bodies were found in isolated areas, and firearms were used in the killings. The prosecution argued that these repeated circumstances could not reasonably be understood as 6 unrelated episodes of self-defense. Instead, they indicated intentional killings accompanied by the taking of property. Wuornos's own changing statements became another important element. She initially and repeatedly described the killings as defensive acts, but later statements included admissions that she had killed the men to take their money or property. The shifting explanations gave prosecutors grounds to challenge her credibility. At the same time, the courts had to consider the evidence relating to each individual victim rather than simply accepting a general theory about the entire series. This distinction is important because the case was not legally resolved as one single trial for 7 deaths. Wuornos was prosecuted for individual murders, and the courts considered the evidence associated with those cases. Peter Seams remained different. Wuornos admitted involvement in his death, and her palm print was connected to his Pontiac after the vehicle was involved in an accident. But Seams's body was never found. Without the body, investigators could not conduct an autopsy or establish a physical cause of death. Wuornos, therefore, did not receive a murder conviction for Seams. The difference between Seams and the 6 other victims illustrates how the criminal justice system treated the available evidence. The investigation could strongly suspect that Seams had died and could connect Wuornos to his vehicle and disappearance. But suspicion alone could not substitute for the proof required for a murder conviction. The 6 convictions were therefore based on cases in which prosecutors were able to establish the murders in court. As the convictions accumulated, Wuornos received death sentences in connection with the 6 murders. The Florida Supreme Court later reviewed the convictions and sentences through the appellate process and upheld them. The legal process also confronted the central question that had existed from the beginning. Was Wuornos a killer acting deliberately for financial gain? Or was she a woman who had killed in response to sexual violence? The courts ultimately rejected her self-defense claims in the cases resulting in conviction. That conclusion did not erase the complexity of her background or the questions surrounding her mental health, but it established the legal judgment regarding the murders. The trials transformed the investigation into a series of formal findings. The police had gathered evidence. Prosecutors had presented it. Defense attorneys had challenged it. Juries had considered the cases. And the courts had imposed the most severe punishment available under Florida law. 6 murder convictions and 6 death sentences now stood against Wuornos. Yet the case was not finished. A death sentence did not mean an immediate execution. Appeals and post-conviction proceedings would follow, and those proceedings would raise new questions about Wuornos's mental condition, her legal representation, and her willingness to continue fighting the sentences. In the years that followed, the Florida courts would repeatedly examine those issues. Wuornos herself would eventually make the extraordinary decision to abandon further legal challenges. But before that final stage, the significance of the trials had already become clear. The prosecution had successfully transformed a sequence of highway encounters, disappearances, shootings, abandoned vehicles, and missing property into 6 legally established murders. The evidence did not answer every question. It could not explain exactly what happened to Peter Seams. It could not independently reconstruct every conversation between Wuornos and her victims. And it could not make every contradiction in Wuornos' statements disappear. But it was sufficient for 6 juries and the courts reviewing their decisions to establish her criminal responsibility. The woman investigators had spent months trying to identify was now a convicted murderer facing execution. The next stage of the story would move away from the crime scenes and trials and into the final years of Wuornos' life. when the central question would no longer be whether she was guilty, but whether the state would ultimately carry out the death sentences imposed upon her. The courtroom battles surrounding Aileen Wuornos did not end when the verdicts were delivered. Conviction was only the beginning of another long phase of the case: appeals, challenges to the sentences, questions about Wuornos' mental condition, and repeated attempts to determine whether the death penalty could legally be carried out. By then, the central facts of the prosecution were firmly established in court. Wuornos had been convicted of 6 murders. She had received 6 death sentences. The courts had examined the evidence connecting her to the killings, including her own statements and the physical evidence associated with the victims. Yet the case continued because a death sentence carries a separate legal process, one in which the courts must consider not only whether a defendant was properly convicted, but also whether the sentence itself can lawfully be imposed. For Wuornos, those proceedings became increasingly complicated as questions surrounding her mental health entered the center of the legal arguments. The distinction between guilt and competency was important. The fact that a defendant had been convicted did not automatically mean that every later legal question had been settled. Wuornos' attorneys challenged aspects of the proceedings and raised issues concerning her mental condition, the effectiveness of legal representation, and the procedures that had been followed during the trials and subsequent appeals. The courts repeatedly reviewed those arguments. Meanwhile, Wuornos herself increasingly expressed a desire to end the legal process. After years of litigation, she became less interested in continuing appeals. This decision created another legal problem. A defendant facing execution cannot simply abandon every safeguard without the courts first determining whether the decision is informed and voluntary. The Florida Supreme Court, therefore, had to examine whether Wuornos understood what she was doing and whether she was competent to make that decision. In 2002, the issue reached the Florida Supreme Court in connection with her decision to waive her lawyers and further post-conviction proceedings. The court examined whether her decision was knowing, voluntary, and made with an understanding of its consequences. On April 1, 2002, the Florida Supreme Court determined that Wuornos was competent to make the decision and approved her waiver of post-conviction counsel and further proceedings. The decision marked an important turning point. For years, the legal system had continued to examine the convictions and sentences. Now the woman at the center of the case was choosing not to pursue the remaining legal avenues available to her. But questions about her mental condition did not disappear simply because she wanted the appeals to end. Her mental health remained an issue in the final stages of the case. Lawyers raised arguments concerning her competency and her ability to understand the proceedings and the consequences of execution. The courts were required to examine those concerns because the legal system cannot simply execute a person without addressing questions that could affect the legality of the punishment. In September 2002, shortly before the scheduled execution, another issue concerning Wuornos' mental condition reached the Florida Supreme Court. The court transferred the matter to the governor for consideration under the applicable legal procedure. Again, the question was not simply whether Wuornos had committed the crimes for which she had been convicted. The question was whether there was a legal reason that the execution should not proceed. The distinction is crucial when looking back at the case. The investigation and trials had focused on evidence of 6 murders. The later proceedings focused increasingly on the validity of the death sentences and Wuornos' condition as execution approached. These were separate legal questions, even though they involved the same defendant. The broader public debate surrounding Wuornos often blurred those distinctions. Her troubled childhood, years of instability, prostitution, alcohol use, relationship with Tyria Moore, and questions about her mental health became part of the public image surrounding the case. But none of those circumstances erased the fact that she had been convicted in court. At the same time, the convictions did not erase the questions about how her background and mental condition should be understood. The case therefore remained controversial even after the verdicts. There was another important complication: Wuornos's own changing explanations. During the investigation and trials, she had maintained that she killed the men in self-defense after they attacked or attempted to sexually assault her. The prosecution rejected that explanation and argued that the killings were intentional and connected to robbery. Later statements from Wuornos included admissions that she had killed the men for their money or property, while she also disputed aspects of the public account of the crimes. Those changing statements complicated the public understanding of her motives. Yet legally, the courts did not have to resolve every question about her inner motives in order to uphold the convictions. The evidence presented at trial had been sufficient for juries to find her guilty, and the Florida Supreme Court upheld the relevant convictions and death sentences through the appellate process. One of the clearest distinctions in the case remained Peter Seams. Wuornos had admitted involvement in his death, and physical evidence connected her to his Pontiac. But Seams's body was never found. Because of that, Wuornos was not convicted of his murder. The contrast between Seams and the 6 convicted killings demonstrated the limits of the legal process. The investigation could associate a person with a disappearance, and a suspect could make admissions, but a murder conviction still required evidence sufficient to establish the crime in court. The 6 convictions, therefore, represented the cases in which prosecutors were able to secure murder verdicts, while Seams remained outside that group. As the final months approached, the legal process narrowed. Wuornos had already received 6 death sentences. Her challenges had been reviewed. The Florida Supreme Court had determined that she was competent to waive further post-conviction proceedings. The remaining efforts to prevent execution did not succeed. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed in Florida by lethal injection. She was 46 years old. Her death brought the formal legal process to an end, but it did not end the questions surrounding the case. The execution closed the criminal proceedings against Wuornos, but it could not provide answers to every uncertainty that remained. Peter Seams had never been found. The precise circumstances of every encounter between Wuornos and the men she killed could not be reconstructed completely. Her explanations had changed, and some elements of her account could never be independently tested. What could be established in court was narrower and more concrete. Wuornos had been convicted of 6 murders, and those convictions and death sentences survived the appellate process. The end of her life also left the victims at the center of a story that had often become dominated by the personality of their killer. Richard Mallory, David Spears, Charles Carskadden, Troy Burress, Charles Humphreys, and Walter Antonio were not simply names in a criminal case. They were 6 men whose lives ended violently and whose deaths became part of one of the most widely known American criminal investigations involving a female serial killer. Peter Seams, whose body was never recovered, remained a particularly stark reminder of what the investigation could not fully resolve. The case also demonstrated how easily a complicated criminal history can be reduced to a single label. Wuornos became known internationally as a female serial killer, but the actual record was more complicated. There was the childhood instability described in her background. There was a life shaped by homelessness and prostitution. There was her relationship with Moore. There were the killings themselves. There were conflicting explanations of motive. There were physical evidence and witness statements. There were convictions and death sentences. And finally, there were legal questions about competency and the right to abandon appeals. None of those elements alone tells the entire story. Together, they form the historical record of the case. When Wuornos died in October 2002, the legal system had reached its final conclusion regarding the 6 murders for which she had been convicted. But the public debate did not disappear. Questions about self-defense, exploitation, mental health, responsibility, and the meaning of punishment continued to surround her name. The case therefore ended in one sense, but not in another. The courts had reached final judgments. The execution had been carried out, yet the human questions remained. What circumstances produce a life that eventually ends in 6 murder convictions and a death sentence? How should a society distinguish between understanding a person's history and excusing their actions? And how should the victims be remembered when the story of the person who killed them becomes larger than their own lives? Those questions could not be answered by a verdict or an execution. They remained after the courtroom doors closed, after the appeals ended, and after Aileen Wuornos was gone.